Welcome everyone to the first Rodney seminar of this academic year. I understand that this is a wonderful and long tradition. For those of you who do not know Walter Rodney, he was an academic and a political activist from Guyana who, I understand, at age 24 received his PhD from SOAS. Not a mean feat. And also was author of a book that was controversial and extremely provocative. The name of it was How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, way back in 1972. He sadly met an untimely death, and I only learned today that he actually was apparently assassinated as he was pursuing a political career in Guyana, his home country. I think it's an interesting thing that we're named after Walter Rodney because he was certainly a provocative person. And I hope that our speakers will provoke all of you as well. So today we are very honored to have with us Dan Connell. And Dan Connell has been working on African issues for a good long time. He started out doing journalism, but also has been an author. And interestingly, has reported for the BBC, Voice of America, Associated Press, Reuters. Dan, for whom haven't you reported?
I can't think of anybody.
Well, that is great. I also was very pleased when we started chatting, and I saw on your bio that you were actually what we call in the diplomatic service persona non grata, thrown out of Eritrea because of your views on the human rights record, which is undoubtedly a red badge of courage. It certainly is the way to succeed in the diplomatic service, to get PNG'd. Definitely on your way to the top. Dan has written several interesting books: Against All Odds, a chronicle of the Eritrean Revolution in 1993, Rethinking Revolution in 2002, Conversations with Eritrean Political Prisoners, 2005. That's enough to get you thrown out of any country, right there. The Historical Dictionary of Eritrea, and an updated edition of Against All Odds. So he has been working for a long time on these issues. We're also proud to say that you've been affiliate of the African Studies Center since 2011.
Yes.
Does that sound right?
Yes.
And today, Dan is going to be speaking on a subject that is perplexing, I think, to all of us, Eritrea and its involvement in the Tigray conflict right now. And you entitled your subject today, Eritrea's role in the Tigray war, of what, how, and why. That pretty much covers all aspects of it. Before I turn the table or the microphone over to you, Dan, would Eric like to add, subtract, or divide anything for our team and for folks coming in via Zoom?
Just to add, at the end, or after Dan's remarks, we will have time for discussion and Q&A. And we invite folks in the room as well as folks on Zoom to participate. I'll go over the instructions for folks who are not familiar with the Zoom raise hand feature before we jump into that section. And then I'll share at the very end a few announcements for upcoming events.
Thanks.
Dan, the floor is yours.
Okay. In November 2020, Ethiopia erupted in an all-out civil war centered in Tigray, in which Eritrean forces played a central role, not only in the fighting, but in setting the stage for the conflict months before the shooting started. That war, initially dubbed a limited law enforcement operation, ebbed and flowed over the next 2 years as three armies, those of the Ethiopian federal state, the state of Eritrea, and the regional government of Amhara, along with Amhara militias and forces from the Afar regional state, fought the Tigrayans. At first, this alliance yielded spectacular victories for Ethiopia and its allies, but it broke down when Tigrayan forces surged back into the towns and cities from which they had withdrawn in early 2021 and drove deep into the regions of Amhara and Afar before they too were forced to pull back. The Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, which controlled Tigray, agreed to a humanitarian truce last March, but it broke down in August as fighting resumed. They are now talking again about another ceasefire that would lead to peace negotiations. But in the meantime, the fighting continues, with drone strikes reported in Tigray this week. However this comes out, the conflict has already exacted a terrible price from the people caught in the crossfire, taking thousands of lives, forcing more than 2.5 million to flee their homes, and plunging the region into a famine that threatens millions with starvation. So how did this essentially political dispute come to this? And what is Eritrea's role in what is an Ethiopian civil war? I'll come back to these and other questions in a moment, but first let me tell you a little bit more about myself and where my information comes from, and then fill in some of the context for the conflict, without which there's no way to make any sense of it. Between 1976 and 2000, I traveled frequently to Eritrea, working as a freelance journalist, an aid worker, a consultant, and a researcher and author, as Mark said in the beginning. I lived there half-time in 2001 and 2002, while producing a country handbook on a project of the Ministry of Information and planning to do a seminar for journalists. But I was ousted in 2002 for criticizing the regime's human rights practices. I didn't actually leave right away. I came back 3 times before my visa ran out because I think nobody wanted to make an issue of it. But after that, I was blocked. During that time, I wrote and edited a number of books, which you've already laid out. The Historical Dictionary actually had 2 editions, one in 2011, and it was updated in 2019 to cover the changes in Ethiopia during that time and in Eritrea. And the second edition of Against All Odds came out last year with an extensive update and reappraisal. I mention that again because this paper draws on that afterward. Since 2002, I've maintained links with sources in the country, including Eritreans, diplomats, and others, as well as exiles and independent experts abroad, and others elsewhere in Ethiopia, Europe, and other sources. Over the past 10 years, I traveled to 19 countries with multiple visits to Ethiopia and Sudan to interview Eritrean refugees, also aid workers, government officials, diplomats, and so on. My most recent trips to Ethiopia were in March 2021 and March 2022, and that is where much of this paper comes from. As most of you are no doubt aware, Eritreans are still waiting for a peace dividend from the 2018 pact between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Instead, they got a new alliance between 2 leaders and a new war against the TPLF that's only now showing signs of a breakthrough, but only between Ethiopia's federal government and TPLF. Eritrea strongly opposes this and remains on the outside, where it will most certainly play the role of a spoiler. I won't reprise Eritrea's complex and conflict-defined history to situate this crisis, except to fill in a few blanks on the origins and development of its current politics, and to say a few words on the Ethiopian civil war and Eritrea's role in it. The political culture of Eritrea's ruling party has always been an authoritarian one, predicated upon the exercise of absolute power by a small number of people who made their decisions in secret. The Eritrean People's Liberation Front, EPLF, was itself led by a clandestine corps known at first as the Eritrean People's Revolutionary Party and later renamed the Eritrean Socialist Party, headed up by now President Isaias Afwerki, who unilaterally dissolved it at the end of the Liberation War. Up to that time, EPRP drafted the EPLF's program, selected the leadership slates prior to elections, and unbeknownst to the front's non-party members, managed its affairs on a daily basis. The Eritrean government established in 1991 was comprised almost exclusively of EPLF guerrillas appointed by President Isaias or his subordinates. Most had also been members of the secret EPRP. Non-party members were encouraged to participate in reconstruction, but were kept at arm's length by the inner core, which functioned as a party within a party, much as EPRP had done during the Independence War. Whether there is such a party today remains an open question, but the state is run, as the front was, by a small, opaque group that has a total monopoly on decision-making and power. A limited political debate in the 1990s over Eritrea's future and its conduct in the border war came to an abrupt halt in 2001 with a sweeping crackdown that started with the detention of 15 dissident military leaders and civilian officials who had signed an open letter criticizing Isaias at the end of the 2-year border war with Ethiopia that had left some 70,000 people dead on both sides. A week after high-profile arrests, the regime shut down all private newspapers and began detaining hundreds more suspected critics, including teachers, artists, writers, and singers. That war and the subsequent crackdown within Eritrea provide the backdrop for the war in Tigray today. In many respects, it's a grudge match for Isaias. But a word on TPLF. This front was formed in the mid-1970s by students and activists in Tigray and Addis Ababa to fight the dictatorship of Mengistu Haile Mariam. It had early support from the EPLF, which came to understand that their future independence depended on weakening the Ethiopian state from within and ousting the Mengistu government. The TPLF was part of this strategy, and it got support from EPLF in the form of arms and training into the mid-1980s, until they fell out over political differences. After this, Eritrea shut off TPLF's access to supplies trucked in from Sudan at the height of the famine that swept the region, an act of political petulance the Tigrayans never forgot, though the two papered over their differences near the end of that decade to join forces to bring down the Mengistu regime. In May 1991, the EPLF took control of Eritrea, and a TPLF coalition called the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF, took over Ethiopia. The two forces, both heading transitional governments, appeared to get along, but the EPLF never accepted the TPLF as an equal, treating it instead as an uppity little brother. This is, of course, a vast oversimplification, but to make a long and complicated story short, they fell out in 1997 over economic and political issues. The two states went back to the war in a bruising conflict that lasted 2 years before Ethiopia broke through Eritrea's defenses to occupy nearly a quarter of the country, at which that point they were stopped from going further. That's the grudge match that I talked about. In May 2000, they agreed to a truce. Ethiopia pulled back from most but not all of Eritrean territory and entered peace talks. The result was a 6-point plan known as the Algiers Agreement that included articles calling for an end to hostilities, return of prisoners, and established independent commissions to arbitrate claims for losses and to delimit and demarcate the contested border, with one paragraph of 16 asserting that the results would be final and binding. However, when the Ethiopia-Eritrea Border Boundary Commission rendered its decision in April 2002, Ethiopia balked at accepting it, and the agreement fell apart. At that point, the two countries settled into a permanent state of hostility that was dubbed a state of no peace, no war, that lasted the next 16 years. Meanwhile, Ethiopia itself was deeply divided by ethnic rivalries that had defined the empire from its earliest years under Amhara rule, which was challenged by several other groups in the 1970s, including not only the Tigrayans, but also the Oromo, the largest group in Ethiopia, and for long, one of the most marginalized. In the mid-1980s, the TPLF built the coalition of Amhara, Oromo, and other forces that became the EPRDF to wage the final battles of the war, though in a harbinger of what was to come. They did so by managing their allies and treating them more like proxies than as peers. In the mid-1990s, the TPLF-led constitution-making process codified a new system of political organization within Ethiopia they called ethnic federalism, nominally establishing equality among the nations and nationalities of the former empire. But in fact, it was one in which the Tigrayans remained more equal than the others, and control the reins of the state, its military and security services, and its economic heights. As a transitional mechanism, this might have worked, but as a permanent one, with this inequality baked into it, it was a recipe for future conflict, which began to play out in earnest in 2015 and 2016 as protests erupted in the Oromo area and elsewhere that triggered a mix of appeasement and repression from the Addis Ababa government. Then, under a sort of caretaker prime minister, who would replace the charismatic TPLF leader Meles Zenawi, who died at the age of 57 in 2012. This all came to a head at the end of 2017. In 2018, everything changed, or it appeared to at least. That February, after a year in which Ethiopia's beleaguered government vacillated between releasing political prisoners, making modest political changes, pledging reforms, and then unleashing bursts of repression, Prime Minister Hailemariam Desalegn abruptly announced his plan to resign. A month later, parties representing the two largest of the four ethnic-based parties in the coalition, Oromo and the Amhara, did an end run around TPLF and chose a candidate from the Oromo party to succeed him, Abiy Ahmed. The new prime minister was an ambitious young officer in the National Intelligence and Security Service who had risen within the Oromo People's Democratic Organization but was not well known outside ruling circles. One of his first acts, announced in his April inauguration speech to Parliament, was a call for peace with Eritrea. He also pledged to improve the economy, reform the country's repressive political system, and more. In June, he went further, promising that Ethiopia would implement the 2002 EEBC boundary decision as written, something the previous regime had repeatedly hedged on. A month later, he met with Isaias and Asmara, and the two jointly announced a 5-point peace plan to end the state of war and reestablish diplomatic relations, trade, transportation, and communications, and to reopen their borders. Overnight, Abiy became a political sensation, both at home and abroad. Ethiopia's first celebrity politician. In December 2019, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Less than a year later, he and his Eritrean and Amhara partners launched an all-out war against TPLF. I was in Ethiopia frequently in the lead up to this crisis, both to monitor the refugee flows and in my capacity as a consultant for the Norwegian Foreign Ministry on peace and security issues. And I watched with horror as what had seemed in 2018 like an opportunity to end the feud between Eritrea and Tigray slip away and set the stage for the war that followed. It was like witnessing a train wreck in slow motion. You knew where it was going, but no one was putting the brakes on as they raced toward each other on a single track. The year had started well enough. Despite a deep-seated cynicism among many Eritreans, hope was stirred in January when Abiy and Isaias met at the two countries' westernmost border towns, Amhara and Humera, to celebrate the opening of a new border crossing. Abiy had included Tigray President Debretsion Gebremichael in his entourage, which Eritrea watchers read as a positive sign. Afterward, a photo of Debretsion and Isaias walking hand in hand while chatting in friendly conversation went viral on social media. You remember that. Was this a breakthrough? If only. When I met Debretsion a couple of weeks later in his office in Mekelle, he clearly thought so. He was optimistic that the two would meet again soon in Asmara. In weeks, not months, he said, to work through their differences and begin the process of reconciliation. But by mid-2019, the writing was on the wall. Isaias had not responded to Debretsion's entreaties, and it became clear that there would be no accommodation between Eritrea's leaders and the TPLF. I watched these events and trends unfold during 5 field visits to the country that year, 2 of which involved visits to the refugee camps and intake centers, but all of which included trips to Tigray, working with my Norwegian counterparts to encourage dialogue and find a way to avoid the disaster we all saw coming. To punctuate the disconnect, Eritrea abruptly and without explanation closed 2 of the 4 border crossings to vehicular traffic in central Tigray. This had the effect of shutting down most of the petty trade that had got underway after the September 2018 opening, much of it benefiting Tigrayan merchants who had much more to offer than their Eritrean counterparts, which is what most observers focused on at the time. But more important, in my view, it halted the informal people-to-people exchanges that have been taking place, with hundreds of people visiting each other's countries for the first time in over 20 years, and coming away shocked at the comparison between the vibrant modern Tigray and the stagnant Eritrea. These visits were as dangerous to the regime and as subversive as anything that TPLF might have had in its toolbox, and they had to be stopped. Throughout the lead up to the conflict, anti-TPLF rhetoric in Eritrean media and from top officials continued unabated, and reports filtered out that Isaias had met with his generals to prepare for potential conflict, claiming that Tigray might attack them. Tigray officials told me in March that progress on reconciliation with Eritrea depended on action from Abiy, but there was no indication he was planning any. Under these conditions, war began to seem inevitable as tensions built on all sides, and Tigray too mobilized, giving its enemies a reason to justify their own preparations in a vicious circle of inflammatory claims and counterclaims. In my view, peace and reconciliation, or at least the first steps to it, had been within reach in January. But in a few short months, it was clear that Isaias was busy building his relations with the Amhara state and with Abiy and the federal government to isolate the Tigrayans. He was a man who nursed grudges for decades, and this was among his most deeply felt. His objective was not peace, but demolishing his nemesis, the TPLF, and sending Tigray back to the Stone Age, so it and its people would never be a threat again. Abiy, deeply offended by the derisive rhetoric the Tigrayans were aiming at him, and angry at what he saw as their standing in the way of his dream of a resurgent unified Ethiopia, was a willing accomplice. In my view, it was Isaias Afwerki who was the driver of this conflict. Meanwhile, the Amhara also had designs on Tigrayan territory well beyond claims for land ostensibly taken from them in the early 90s. That was a feature of it too. In early February 2020, Ethiopia abruptly and without warning or preparation withdrew prima facie acceptance for Eritrean refugees, creating instant confusion among officials and threatening a social crisis in Tigray as hundreds of Eritreans crossed without registering and made their way to towns and cities that had no services to accommodate them. The sudden policy change followed a meeting in Asmara between Isaias and Abiy, in which Isaias reportedly demanded a reduction in refugees as a condition for continuing normalization talks. In retrospect, I think this can be seen as the first salvo of the war. Its effect was to place the refugees on the defensive and neutralize them in advance of the fighting to come. It also demonstrated who was calling the shots. Then came the pandemic, which brought with it both new problems and unforeseen opportunities, as such crises often do. As Isaias used it to shut Eritrea down altogether on March 27th. This had the effect of sharply curtailing internal movement and curbing public acts of protest, such as those of the underground Yakal movement, enough that they had been carrying out by distributing leaflets in the night, painting anti-government graffiti on the sides of buildings, and other such gestures. Meanwhile, he stepped up the use of GIFAs, forceful roundups, to catch national service evaders in an effort to deal with the depleted lower ranks of the military, all of which ought to have been a tip-off to what was in the offing. Momentum toward war gained force within Ethiopia and between Eritrea and Tigray through most of 2020. The idea that the war was caused by a November TPLF attack on an ENDF, that's the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, armed depot in Tigray is absurd. It's like saying the 1998 border war was all about a small clash in a village called Badme. Sparks don't cause wars. They enable them once the kindling is in place, which was demonstrated in this case by the rapidity and character of the response. Within hours of the incident, Tigray was attacked by three allied armies, the ENDF, EDF, the Eritrean Defense Forces, and Amhara Special Forces, plus an amalgam of undisciplined but well-armed Eritrean youth brigades known collectively as the Fano. By coincidence, the French embassy in Addis had a researcher on Tigray's southwestern border with the Amhara state who had witnessed the buildup a week earlier and watched the invasion unfold on the 20th. By early January, the Amhara had taken control of and ethnically cleansed large areas of the west and south, a region they had controlled before 1991 and still claimed as their own. This was an essential reason for the Amhara participation in the war and had the added benefit of sealing off Tigrayan access from and egress to Sudan, blocking refugees seeking to get out to tell their stories, while preventing the Tigrayan resistance from establishing a secure supply corridor. For their part, the EDF, the Eritrean forces, recaptured land assigned to Eritrea by the 2002 Boundary Commission decision that TPLF had refused to vacate, and expanded them to establish a substantial buffer zone in northern Tigray before moving further south to occupy a good deal more, wreaking havoc on the civilian population wherever they went. The weak link in this alliance was actually the Ethiopian army, which had been set back initially and battered by the fighting that followed. Their command structures had also been weakened prior to the wall by Abiy's political and ethnic purges of Tigrayan officers, especially in the middle ranks where it matters most in such combat. So they were off to a poor start. The solution they found was to use more Eritreans in the fighting. As Eritrea redeployed whole divisions to central and southern Tigray and to other conflict areas within Ethiopia, Abiy's dependence on Isaias grew. So too did international calls for a cessation of hostilities, unfettered humanitarian access, and the withdrawal of Eritrean forces, which Isaias adamantly but quietly opposed, and which Abiy dithered on, denying the Eritreans were even there until April. The Amhara had most of what they wanted by this time, so they hunkered down to consolidate their gains, driving any remaining Tigrayans out and moving Amharas in. Behind the scenes, Abiy and Isaias were said to be plotting to link their two states in some form of federation or confederation, providing a rationale for Eritreans to fight within and on behalf of Ethiopia, which gave Isaias a long-awaited wedge to gain a major foothold in the empire he had always coveted. His idea had long been to reconnect the two states when he was in a position to dominate the resulting entity. He first raised that question with me in the 70s. No doubt Abiy had an agenda of his own, but in my view, he was being outmaneuvered by a consummate strategist who had been at this game a lot longer than Abiy and had been waiting and planning for this for years. 5 months into what Abiy called a short-term law and order operation, I went back to Ethiopia. When I got to Addis in March 2021, Abiy, whose credibility was wearing thin, finally admitted that Eritrean soldiers were in Ethiopia and had been since November. He also conceded that fighting had bogged down in a growing insurgency that he called tiresome, but vehemently denied any responsibility for atrocities being reported. However, by April, a host of professional researchers and investigative reporters were documenting what had happened in depth. Among the more egregious massacres was one in the historic town of Aksum in November, with many civilians murdered by Eritrean soldiers inside the iconic St. Mary's Church. Estimates of the dead ran into the hundreds. This came after a battle with Tigrayan forces within the city. One of those to document the incident was Amnesty International, which had been burned once by a too hasty report about a massacre in the western Tigray village of Maikadra, often cited by Abiy in a cynical game of whataboutism. AI later conceded that it got only half the story of a gruesome and chaotic melee involving both Amharas and Tigrayans in the killing spree, and they took almost 3 months to get the one on Aksum out. The role of EDF soldiers in the Aksum massacre was later confirmed by Human Rights Watch, CNN, and numerous others, among them Ethiopia's own state-funded Human Rights Commission. The EHRC's March 23rd report cited the killings of more than 100 Tigrayan civilians, and it was based on interviews with 45 family members of victims, as well as survivors, eyewitnesses, and religious leaders. It concluded, and I quote, "These widespread human rights violations committed by the Eritrean soldiers who were present in Aksum city at the time of the incident are not ordinary crimes, but constitute grave contraventions of applicable international and human rights laws and principles." That's the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. CNN did an exhaustive report on a massacre by Eritrean troops that began on November 30th and went on for 3 days in and around a centuries-old rock-hewn monastery, the Mariam Denglat, on the eastern escarpment in the district of Adago Hamus. In April, BBC's African Eye investigative team reconstructed another that had been captured on smartphones in March and was circulated widely on social media that showed soldiers rounding up young Tigrayan men, executing them on the lip of a cliff, and kicking them and pushing them over the side. The BBC analysis proved that geotagged videos of the slaughter were authentic and confirmed the location. They also proved that the perpetrators were from the ENDF, demonstrating, if it had needed to be, that the Eritreans were not the only ones guilty of monstrous behavior. Incidentally, there were also reports of Tigrayan atrocities that have been well documented, but these were among the worst. As the stories came out by reporters getting into Amhara-controlled areas and interviewing refugees who had fled them, it became clear that the Amhara Special Forces and allied militias were guilty of horrendous crimes done as part of a comprehensive ethnic cleansing operation designed to establish facts on the ground prior to any post-conflict talks. Two of the most powerful and well-documented accounts of this, and of the use of rape as a political weapon, were an investigation by CNN broadcast in March that was headlined, "Practically, this has been a genocide," quoting a doctor who had treated rape victims, and an Associated Press investigative report published in April that was headlined, "Leave No Tigrayan. In Ethiopia, an ethnicity is erased." Hospitals and clinics within Tigray and in refugee camps in Sudan reported hundreds of rapes, 174 alone at the Eider Hospital in Mekelle by March. But overall estimates of those assaulted, most of whom were afraid or unable to speak out, ran into the thousands. Guilty parties included soldiers of both EDF and ENDF and members of the Amhara Special Forces and its allied militias. Reuters documented the collapse of Tigray's vaunted healthcare system in early February due to the looting of medicines and medical equipment and destruction of facilities. And the New York Times reported that the U.S. State Department had prepared an internal assessment that month describing the systematic ethnic cleansing of Tigrayans from areas falling under its control. Considerable evidence was also accumulating that starvation was being used as a weapon of war. As the war stretched from March into April, this meant that farmers might not be able to sow crops for the following year, leaving hundreds of thousands at both immediate and long-term risk. One of the most comprehensive analyses of how this was playing out, titled "Starving Tigray: How Armed Conflict and Mass Atrocities Have Destroyed an Ethiopia Region's Economy and Food System and Are Threatening Famine," was released in April by a team of researchers with the World Peace Foundation, based at Tufts University. The 58-page report, backed by extensive eyewitness testimony and photographic evidence from ground level and satellite, as well as extensive documentation from other sources, details the widespread and systematic looting of hospitals and clinics, schools, banks, hotels, and other public and private infrastructure, asset stripping of people's homes, farms, and businesses, taking animals, seeds, tools, supplies, furniture, and equipment, without which the people from whom it is stolen cannot make a living, damage to industrial sites, including pharmaceutical, cement, leather, and other manufacturing plants, mining operations, a flour mill, a garment factory, and much more. It also documents the wholesale destruction of 2 of the 4 refugee camps for Eritreans in Tigray, including vocational training facilities built by international aid agencies, schools, administrative buildings, and other structures. And it documents numerous instances of rape and starvation as weapons of war, to paint a gruesome picture of an alliance bent on not only defeating an armed foe, but of exterminating the social base on which it rests. It was the wanton sabotage of what was left behind as much as what was plundered that revealed the intent to destroy the underpinnings of the Tigray economy and strip its people of the ability to survive. The report concluded that the governments of Ethiopia and Eritrea are starving the people of Tigray, and that the evidence suggests this was intentional, systematic, and widespread. There is a word for this that I do not use lightly: it's genocide. At a minimum, the responsible parties are guilty of crimes against humanity. At the time of writing, there is evidence of civilian killings and possible war crimes by all sides, though in the main committed by the Eritrean, Amhara, and Ethiopian government forces against the people of Tigray. This led to a rising chorus of calls for a humanitarian ceasefire and an independent investigation of atrocities and crimes by an international commission set up for this purpose. But for me, after nearly half a century of engagement, The question that gnawed away at me was not just what happened, but why and how. How had this movement, the Eritrean liberation struggle, I chronicled over several decades, come to this? To better comprehend what lies behind their conduct and the changes in values and behavior of the Eritrean armed forces in Tigray, I draw from the scholarship on cults and cult behavior. The EPLF's transformation into what I would characterize as a political cult had roots in its early experience and took shape as a mature belief system after the EPLF's 1978 so-called strategic retreat, a reversal of fortune in which the EPLF withdrew from towns and cities it had captured and administered after Ethiopia ousted the United States as its main ally and arms supplier and welcomed the Soviet Union to take its place, kicking off a massive Soviet intervention that was both military and deeply political. As such, it not only altered the balance of armed force, it triggered a loss of ideological balance within EPLF and its vanguard, the EPRP, and in the movement's perceptions of itself in the wider world. The upshot was a turning inward, in which the leadership elevated Eritrean nationalism to the status of a secular religion, creating, in essence, a political cult. The ensuing struggle came to a head less than a decade after independence with the onset of the border war, the subsequent political crackdown, and the return to the bunkers. The period after 2001 and 2002 was thus defined by a return to isolation, partly imposed from without, but in large part cultivated from within. As in the 1970s, Eritrea faced an existential threat that called for extreme sacrifice and absolute submission. Anything less was to put the nation at risk, so the leaders said. To express doubt was not simply to break the rules, but to commit a heresy, to be a traitor to the nation. These conditions enabled the cult's consolidation, the results of which we're now seeing on the battlefield. Consider for a moment, the basic mechanics of cult formation. First, isolation. Members are cut off from the outside world, and their contacts are limited to cult members and leaders while fostering a strong we, they, us against them ethos. Second, dependency. Unquestioning loyalty and submission are demanded, with members told how and what to think without expressing doubts or raising questions. This is enforced through punishment, shame, and ostracism of those who stray. Third, fear. Doubt or insubordination is punished with physical abuse and emotional trauma, usually involving humiliation and exclusion in front of peers. Fourth, indoctrination. Members are pushed not only to give up feelings of personal independence, but to break ties with family, friends, and other group identities or belief systems. First comes the teardown, then the rebuild. 5, the leader. Cults need a charismatic leader who serves as a role model to whom unquestioned loyalty and obedience rise to a level of hero worship. Following such a leader is empowering. 6, vocabulary and ritual. Affirmative rituals are essential to identity replacement and the cementing of one's primary loyalty to the cult. This is achieved through shared activities and seminars that give the member an all-encompassing worldview, in this case with Eritrea at its center. And 7th, defense mechanisms. The development of strong defenses against external challenge or personal doubt, coupled with the threat of excommunication and utter exclusion from the group for leavers. All these are present in Eritrea today, more so within the national service and the military than anywhere else. The 16 to 20-year-old soldiers deployed to the front lines in Tigray were groomed for months for the 2020-2021 campaign, indoctrinated to view Tigrayans, all not just fighters, as devious and subhuman, often called snakes, never to be trusted, always to be hated for what they did to Eritrea in the 1998-2000 war, and for a litany of other betrayals over the years. And many of the young fighters unleashed on the Tigrayans were lacking in the experience or perspective to question this, and unable or unwilling to doubt what they were being sent to do. Once initiated in the fever of killing, plunder, rape, and destruction, there was no turning back. As I've thought about this, I've often reflected on interviews I did in the mid-1990s with 2 child soldiers in Gulu, Uganda, one 14, the other 16, who had escaped from Joseph Kony's infamous Lord's Resistance Army. Their induction involved joining a circle of other children, into the center of which was thrust a renegade, someone caught trying to get away, in a kind of orchestrated acting out of Lord of the Flies. It was their task to beat him or her to death. If they showed hesitation, they'd be thrown into the ring with the victim. From there, it was only a short step to joining in attacks on villages of strangers and killing anyone in their paths. The two kids I spoke with talked in flat monotones with no emotional affect, as if they were automatons delivering a recording. It left me deeply unsettled, but at least at that point, they were in a therapeutic setting where they faced their own histories in a long and difficult effort to overcome them. Whatever Eritrea's future has in store, facing, process, and healing from this has to be a part of it, both for their sake and for Eritrea's. Meanwhile, what can be done to break the momentum of this rolling catastrophe, which is by no means over? Assuming they get to a place where genuine peace negotiations take place, here's the outline of what a solution might look like within Ethiopia. First, TPLF accepts Abiy Ahmed as the Prime Minister of the federal government. In exchange, the Prime Minister withdraws legal charges against TPLF leaders, including those in prison, and recognizes them as representatives of the Tigray state. Next steps, in one order or another, have to include exchange of prisoners and the internationally monitored return of IDPs to their places of origin, an independent investigation by a mutually agreed upon body into the origins and causes of the conflict and the war crimes committed by all sides during it, an inventory of damages to people and property during the conflict by an independent, mutually acceptable body, with reparations to be paid by perpetrators, a final agreement between Eritrea and Ethiopia, including Tigray, that ends all hostilities and threats, demarcates the Eritrean Ethiopia boundary according to the 2002 EEBC decision, and gives back the territory that was theirs. A pullout of Amhara forces from areas it occupied during the fight, accompanied by a Tigrayan agreement to abide by decisions on boundaries and governance determined through a mutually agreed upon mechanism to adjudicate disputes. There will also need to be a massive emergency relief effort, followed by the arduous process of reconstructing Tigray and healing the rifts created by the war. And what would a change in Eritrea look like in the event of a change there and the start of a post-dictatorship transition? In my view, the basics of what it would take to get the country back on track to be an open, peaceful, and inclusive future are well known. The establishment of a transitional council that includes all major stakeholders and has a specified mandate and end date, the release of political prisoners, including those held for questioning government policies, trying to flee the country, or engaging in banned religious practices, in addition to other acts of protest or resistance, real or imagined. A return to the original 18 months terms of national service, coupled with a phased demobilization of those who have already served, while carrying out a full assessment of this program to lay the basis for comprehensive long-term reform. A constitutional conference to either reform the one ratified in 1997 or draft a new one. And finally, the opening of Eritrea's economy to absorb demobilized conscripts, released prisoners, and returning refugees into the labor force, starting by removing limits on access to currency and lifting restrictions on businesses. International funding to support economic recovery and the transition of the education and healthcare systems is also necessary, as is a truth and reconciliation process through which to face what the country's been through and move on without laying the groundwork for future division and conflict, and without forgetting what happened or exacting revenge for its own sake. And after a 2 to 4 year transition, multi-party elections to take place to establish an inclusive representative government to resume the interrupted process of state building they began in the 1990s. I realize that's a stretch, but that's where I'm going to end. So that was really a schematic representation of what happened. There are a lot of empty spaces there, and I'm happy to take on any questions.
Dan, thank you very much. And I'd be glad to open the floor. I have to say, that was really a kind of a horrifying depiction of the forces that led to this current catastrophe. And it was in the midst of all of the terrible things that you described there, gratifying to see you lay out ideas about how to make our way out of this, or how parties can make their way out of this. I'd be glad to let anyone ask a question, but if I could just ask an opening question. You laid out a program against this background of history and revenge and conflict. And you certainly have people you consider principally responsible. Do you see any evidence or any hope for political will on the party's part to embark on the kind of reforms and programs you've suggested? Where might it come from?
Well, I mean, there's two things that I laid out. One was a scenario that could happen in a different Eritrea. And the other is a scenario for getting to peace within Ethiopia. Ethiopia, of course, is much more complicated than just Tigray. So it has to fit into the larger picture of what they're doing in Ethiopia. In my view, I think there have to be changes on all sides. The Tigrayans have to give some, and the central government has to give some, the Amhara have to give some. But what about Eritrea? Eritrea is not part of Ethiopia, and they are a wild card here. As I mentioned, they're not part of the talks, and they could play the role of a spoiler in whatever Abiy does. The way it has looked to me is that Abiy has at various times been inclined toward talks and to see where this could go, and then something has stopped him. I think the something is Eritrea. No evidence, hard evidence for that, but I've seen that happen over and over again in this situation and others. The Tigrayans also have to tone down their rhetoric and be ready to compromise with the Amhara, for one, on the territories that are under dispute. There are territories that had historically had Amhara and Tigrayans living in them. And the problem here is not just that one is powerful and takes it, then the other is and it takes it, but that the structure of the state itself is based on this ethnic federalism, a winner-take-all structure in which there are no protections really for minorities. Not none, but not enough. What this calls for is a different arrangement in which an area like the Wolkite district of Western Tigray, or Northern Amhara, as people would also say, needs to be governed so that both peoples living in those borders have representation and their rights protected. How do you do that? Maybe you have to make it an autonomous district under a new form of governance, like the city-states really of Djibouti, not Djibouti, Diradawa and Addis. I don't know, but there has to be a change that accommodates all the interests of the people there. And your question was, is there the political will to get there? You know, it ebbs and flows with the military situation. At one point, it seemed like they were both ready to talk because they each had to first accept the fact that they couldn't win. Neither side has the capacity to win this. But then they seem to creep back into conflict. Now, the drone strikes that I described, there are drone strikes and aerial attacks on Mekelle and other civilian targets this week, 2 days ago, actually. That doesn't set up an atmosphere in which anybody is going to trust a solution. The Tigrayans are still under siege. Their telephone service is cut off. Their banking system is interrupted. And their electrical system is all controlled from the outside. So until all of these steps are taken, I think the Tigrayans are going to still be spoilers within the Ethiopian situation too, because they're not going to compromise until they get some guarantee that they're not going to get crushed in the process. And Abiy's not going to compromise if it means that he's going to unravel Ethiopia. So the answer to your question is a difficult one. I don't see it right now, but they're close enough to it that they could get to it.
Thanks very much. Would you like to jump in from here or from Zoom land?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Very helpful description of what happened and all. I don't know if you could see it in the chat. I posted a couple questions. I'm not sure how much time we have, so maybe what I could say, from my perspective, ethnic federalism has been a disaster. Ethiopians, of course, the ethnicities were there, but there was not ethnic division like we see it today. What's your view in terms of the ethnic federalism way of governing, and is that a sustainable way to go, or is there an alternative? There are other questions, but I'm going to come back to them if there's an opportunity later.
I mentioned in the talk that I thought as a transitional mechanism, it would have been possible, and it could have helped. It was never viewed that way officially, or at least if it was, it didn't get implemented. I actually talked with Meles Zenawi in June of 2012, about 2 months before he died, and raised that question with him. And he had said to me then that they had seen it as a transitional mechanism, but it never got off the ground in that way, and it was by really 2005 reified into a more semi-permanent one. As a long-term way of governing Ethiopia, it's been, as I said, a disaster. It set up a recipe for struggle, for conflict, and that conflict was erupted, of course, in 2015 and afterward, and it's still playing out. As an initial mechanism, though, if you look at the situation in Ethiopia in the 1990s, when it was first conceived, you're coming out of a long history of one-sided domination by one group over the other. The other is plural. And the idea initially was to give basic equality among all of them. Now, the Tigrayans, as 6% of the population, never did that and couldn't really afford to. So it was a doomed project from the start. I think that's where you and I would agree.
What do you think is the alternative?
Well, I mean, at this point, I think you have to go back into some form of federalism that is maybe more geographical than it is ethnic, and that involves representation of multiple ethnicities within an area, and a commitment to equality among the regions.
Thank you, Dan. One question I think everyone has in listening to your talk about the rise of Eritrea's role in this conflict is, how are they able to do so much and get away with it? And I want to pose it to you because I have my own understanding of what I think has led up to their confidence, but maybe you have a separate response. But it really focuses, in my opinion, on this concept of plausible deniability. You mentioned that Ethiopia reluctantly admitted that Eritrean forces were involved in the conflict in 2021. If you check the state broadcaster's YouTube channel, I'm talking about the Eritrean state broadcaster, the day that they allegedly said that they were not involved, they had no reports about what was happening in Tigray. The same day that the elections in the United States were occurring, November 3rd, 2020, is the same day that the conflict began. I think that's a combination of different factors that have allowed the Eritrean government to escape responsibility. And just in more recent or more relevant terms, the war in Ukraine has seen a very multipolar sort of atmosphere in terms of political alignments. And Eritrea voted with Russia on the UN General Assembly, and they were recently reelected to the Human Rights Council, despite multiple attempts to kind of get them to admit responsibility. And they've been able to just say, hey, we don't tell our citizens that this stuff is going on. So I kind of want to understand where Dan comes from this perspective is, how do you think they've been able to just deny everything and kind of just move forward with what has happened in the conflict?
Ooh, it's a very good question, and it's a consistent pattern, as you mentioned. I think you've hit on part of it. That they keep a low profile, and they don't get out and try to make counterclaims a lot of the time. Certainly, they don't make any claims at all unless they have to. In the case of the situation at home, the regime is covering in its media new dams repairs on streets and other small-scale advances in the education area and others, when this war is going on, as if it didn't exist. I don't think it's plausible deniability, though, because everybody understands that they're getting only half the story in Eritrea and outside. Nobody really took the situation seriously when Abiy kept denying that the Eritreans were there, and the Eritreans didn't claim it. I don't think. Because it was very obvious that they were from day one. They are not interested in Asmara, in the international community's responses to what they do, except insofar as they interfere. So they say as little as they can. I mentioned earlier that the government has been predicated on secrecy inside the society and within the state itself. Since the beginning. The decisions that are made in Eritrea are still all done in secret among a small group of people. Even the national budget is not published. The population of the country is not published, despite the fact that they issue ID cards to every citizen. So they know exactly who's in the country and how many people there are from one region, ethnicity, or religious group, or another. They are obsessed with secrecy, and they have followed that in international relations, of course, in the same way they have inside. So I don't think there's any real difference there. The international community, though, has to be clear that that's the case and not get somehow diverted. And I think the diversion comes not because Eritrea is clever, but because interests dictate that the international community not contest it, because what did they then do? And if you're not ready to do something about it, it's better just to keep your head down. The Ukraine situation has really crowded out coverage of the war in Tigray and many other issues too. So it was in the New York Times, for example, almost once a week for the first few months. And then when Ukraine came up this year, it disappeared. So this is competing coverage that the Eritreans are taking advantage of.
Gideon?
I wanted to ask, so you had mentioned that there had been attacks on refugee camps in the Tigray area, correct me if I'm wrong, by the Eritrean forces.
Yes.
Why were those a major target for the Eritreans? What was their sort of motive in attacking refugees from, you had said, from Eritrea? So
Well,
what was their goal?
First of all, there were 4 major camps in Tigray of Eritreans. The 2 that were attacked were the northern 2, Gitsats and Shemelba, and they were closest to the Eritrean border. I think they were attacked in part because the government wanted to eliminate any possible support for opposition that was close to them. And these two camps were close enough. The other two are down near the Amhara state, and actually under now the administration, I think, of the Amhara state too, around them. So the danger they faced was coming from the two camps that they took over. They moved in them. They rounded people up. They called for people to come to a central spot, and then informers who had been planted within the population before identified those who were sympathetic to or involved in oppositional activity. They were taken away. Some were shot on the spot. Some were taken back to Eritrea. So they were really diffusing a threat and also increasing the level of fear within the population. And that has always been, as I mentioned in the cult discussion, a way that they have managed to keep themselves in power. So I would say there are multiple issues. Those camps also, in the Eritrean view, were magnets to pull people out of Eritrea. I don't think that was really the case. The people don't leave their home to be in a camp where they are basically treated, like second-class citizens within the country. But that was the myth, at least, that they held and broadcast. So that was also part of it.
If I can just add just to that, we have a comment here from George following up that it's important to know that Hitsats was close to being shut down permanently after Ethiopia stopped the prima facie policy in January 2020, partly because the Eritrean government saw the refugee camps as hotbeds for political opposition.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's why I called the change in policy in basically January of 2020, the first salvo of the war, in a way. This is the first time in the two countries' relations that they had done that. Up until that time, anybody coming from Eritrea or any other border state was given status as a refugee within Ethiopia if they asked for it. And the Eritreans had had a privileged situation under Tigrayan governance. They ended up having the worst situation of neighboring states under the new government of Abiy Ahmed. And that came directly out of a meeting between Isaias and Abiy and Asmar.
Yeah, thanks for a really great talk. I was just curious to know more about your thinking around Isaias Afwerki as I think that he used the term that grudge match, and then there's another really fascinating idea that he's interested in supporting the reconnection of the two countries once he was in a position to control the resulting political entity. And I was just curious to know more about how you came to that conclusion.
Well, one way was by listening to him talk in the 1970s, and another was sitting down with him in the 1990s after the referendum in which Eritrea voted overwhelmingly for sovereignty. I was representing, I think, the Christian Science Monitor at that point, and I was in a meeting with a BBC reporter in his office. And I said to him, first of all, I said, how does it feel to be in this situation? And he basically said, I don't feel anything. This is, I have so much work to do in front of me that I can't stop to be sentimental. But then I asked him what he saw as the future relations between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And he said, it would start with economic and other relations, and then it could move into political relations, and there's no limit on where they could go. And I read that as a confirmation of views that I had heard from the 1970s onward, that he saw Eritrea and Ethiopia as connected, that his own ambition was to be the dominant force within that connection, but he needed to get Eritrea independent and strong first as a base to operate. He has always operated within organizations that nest within other organizations. I've used the Matryoshka dolls, the Russian dolls, as a kind of model for that. He did that in high school when he first was a political activist. He's done it as the EPRP within the EPLF, within the liberation struggle. He's done it with relations among coalitions in neighboring states, in Sudan, in Somalia. And it's all predicated on getting a lever into a situation where you can increase your own power and leverage within the larger arena. And so, for example, when he pushed, I think this was his idea more than Abiy's, the idea of building a sub-regional alliance with Somalia. I mean, Somalia, what is it? It's part of Mogadishu. But he has an alliance between Abiy, him, and Somalia that are all weak states, really, that he can control. He did not go into IGAD when he had the chance, the regional body, or into the AU seriously, because those he can't manipulate. But he's building a little beachhead, so to speak. And Abiy takes the credit and makes all the big speeches about it, but it's really Isaiah's thinking this through.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for your very insightful report. But I'm an Ethiopian, and I have some questions and some fact checks for you. That way, just so we can, have different opinions, different, the war started between November 3rd and 4th by TPLF, and they admitted they started it, and the Sekou Touré and General Tigray admitted that, and they on ongoing war. Most of the war is done now in Afar and Amhara regions. It's not in Tigray. So the people of Tigray are under siege. Yes, I admit that. And they are under siege by TPLF, not by Ethiopian government, because nobody is fighting in Tigray. The fight is in Afar region, where the road map to Mekelle or Tigray is closed by the TPLF forces. And you were very passionate about the Lord of that kids, child soldiers, and you forgot to mention that just the Tigrayan forces are using child soldiers, which are 12 and 13 and even less, and which is admitted by their World Health Organization leader, Dr. Tedros. He tweeted sometimes ago like pride, and he posted those pictures with kids with Kalashnikov and AR-15. In December and January and after that of 2020, after they start the war, they start attacking Eritreans. And as any sovereign country, Eritrea has the right to defend itself. And I believe that's what they did. And if there is any other thing, just that need to be investigated and confirmed by international body. But there are some things that just you missed.
When did they do this?
They when the war started after November 3rd of 2020, okay. The TPLF launched just launchers in Eritrea, and they admit those things that are factually admitted by them or proven. But when you mention just the TPLF, the World Food Program, before even this one, the current one, USAID admitted they looted their store for food and oil and food substance that aid to the people of Tigray and the people of Amhara. And they looted the schools, they looted hospitals, they looted churches, and they raped kids, they killed innocent people, they massacred in Maikadra massacre, Agamsa, and Kobo, and there are several massacre places, and still they are finding mass graves in Amhara region where they were for the last 2 years. And
Thank you.
World Food Program. Let me ask the question. So, World Food Program admitted they stole 570,000 liters of fuel, and still the World Food Program sending trucks. Over 1,400 trucks are not returned, and they are being used for transporting military power. So this thing is, you should not be forgetting, just to be partial, partial to both sides, so we can see, everything on this. But at the same time, also, I'm just confused, when I see all these white people in African studies, where are the Africans that should be studying about Africa?
Is that your question?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
well, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, there's a ton of things that you've raised, many of which I completely disagree with, and I don't think there's any factual basis for, but there is for some of them. I'm certainly not trying to say that the Tigrayans have not done bad things. They're not angels here. The attacks on, first of all, the start of the war, as I laid out early on, was not November 3rd. That's the first shooting incident, but the groundwork for this was laid many months before. And the fact that there were Amhara forces and Eritrean forces poised along the border that came into Tigray on November 3rd and 4th, right after the first incident, is clear indications that the buildup was ready, and it just mattered. It was a question of who was going to fire first. The Tigrayans fired the first shots. Nobody disagrees with that. But the Badme situation that I compared it to in the border war in 1998 is a similar situation. There was an incident there that kicked off a 2-year border war, a brutal war in which 70,000 people were killed on both sides. Is Badme really the cause of that? No. It was the trigger. It was the straw that broke the back, so to speak. But to locate things like that, to say who fires first, is silly. It really just misses the point. There was a large momentum building for war that I described in some depth, that broke out really in November of 2020. The Tigrayans made a miscalculation, in my view, in that attack, but I can't agree that it is the cause of the war and that they started it. I also said child soldiers. I don't know about child soldiers in Tigray, but I wouldn't doubt that they're taking anybody who will fight, because they're at great risk of being destroyed as a people. And this is an issue to be investigated later on, and is part of an overall investigation of war crimes. And if they're guilty, they should be punished and exposed for it. So I'm not trying to cover up what they've done, but I think on balance, the attacks by 3 different armies on a state in which there was the kind of widespread looting of property, killing of people, documented over and over again, rape as a political weapon. I mean, come on, how can you equate those two?
Thank you so much for this presentation. Very informative. My question is, the UN chief spokesperson, Stephanie Durjik, had described this as a breaking point, a crucial breaking point with the situation in Tigray. And then you have the African Union Ambassador Obajano, who's also kind of advocating for a number of changes. You have the EU and US peace envoys. The recent President Ruto has also tipped his predecessor to serve as an envoy in bringing some resolve to Tigray. The African Union also has, a peace envoy. My question is to you, Dan, is who or what combination of actors could serve as peace brokers in this situation?
Should we take a couple more?
Yeah, Gabe, do you want to share your question, and then George as well, and then
Okay. First, the first question is earlier when you talk about Isaias, you mentioned his organization EPLF and then EPRP was the other thing. I never knew that EPRP, if it's the Ethiopian People's Revolution Party.
No.
Okay, that's a different thing.
No, but they were formed at the same time out of
Yes.
intellectuals in Addis.
Right.
And I think it's not an accident that they have a similar name.
Oh, okay. There is EPRP in Eritrea. There was
Yeah,
another.
which was actually formed in Eritrea, but it was formed by intellectuals coming out of Haile Selassie University.
And the other thing, maybe I'm trying to add to what I think the previous person said. Who started the fight? Is Abiy did, I think, maybe it was worth mentioning. Maybe he sent peace delegation of elders and everything, trying to make peace with the Tigrayan leaders when they were not accepting him. And from the moment he came to power, they did not. And when the people saw the tension, I think he sent peace delegation of, elders, including church. But there is also history of both. I mean, I remember we talked this about in the past. Both EPLF and TPLF has this culture of military. It's an armed revolt who became victorious, and they have this what do you call hubris. We are a big power, and
Gabi, just as we're running out of time,
Okay.
to be fair, could you ask
So,
a question?
don't you think that psychology played, because they were the one who was itching for a fight, and we are the only power, and they were showing, and they started militias, Amhara militias, Tigrayan started the militias. So that's another. The last question is how do you see TPLF? Is TPLF means the Tigrayan people? The way you talk is a little bit. It seems like TPLF represents kind of the whole Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Don't you think the Tigrayans, which are
Okay, good questions. Do we have time for one more?
Squeeze it in. You mentioned at the very beginning that you wanted provocative speakers, and I think, Dan, mission accomplished. All I wanted to ask, you mentioned the 5-point peace deal in 2018. That was a very significant moment for Eritreans, but the actual details were kept secret. Why do you think that was the case? Thank you.
Okay, Dan.
Okay, that last question is maybe the easiest. I think that they're still secret, and this was typical of Isaias and his insistence on secrecy. It's increasingly been the MO of Abiy as well. I would love to know what was agreed upon between them on that first day, but I don't. So the other things that have been raised, my God, there's so many here. We could go
There's a
on for
question
half an
on
hour.
peace brokers.
yeah, who could be a peace
Yeah,
broker?
who could be a peace broker, I think, is one of the best questions. The African Union seems to be in a place where they are trusted by both sides. Ethiopia seemed to want them in the beginning, and the Tigrayans balked. But I think that some combination of outside forces, like was the case with the Eritreans and Ethiopia, which was then the Tigrayans controlling Ethiopia, in the 2000-2001 period, can work with the UN, the AU, and others, and the EU perhaps as partners in this, with the AU taking the lead role. But the real question here is, when do the two parties have the will to get to a solution? And that first question that Mark asked, I think, is the right one, because until they do, it doesn't matter who's mediating. When they do, it'll be easy. On the question of TPLF as representing the Tigrayan people, they actually have set up another coalition, the TDF, the Tigrayan Defense Forces, as their military operation. They're the head of the state because they won an election that, as far as I know, was freer and fairer than any they'd had before. So they are the default representative at this point of a state. I don't think they represent all the people. The young people in Tigray are increasingly restive under TPLF control. And there's a generational phenomenon going on here similar to that in the Eritrean context. But they are what we have at this point. So I think they are going to be key to solving this problem. There are several other smaller parties that are interesting. Baitona, for example. The Salsawi Tigray is another one. Tigray Independence Party is another one. These are parties that are small but growing with support in the youth. And they tend to be more nationalist than the TPLF. So they might be more difficult for Abiy to deal with than TPLF is. Be careful what you ask for.
Okay, this has been a wonderful discussion. And Dan, I want to thank you for presenting such a complex subject in great depth and drawing on such significant knowledge of the parties and even the individuals involved. That really is something I think quite special for all of us to hear. It's obviously one of the hardest issues out there right now, but it will take this kind of discussion to find our way to some possible solutions. And as someone said already, you definitely satisfied the requirement for being provocative. So thank you very much for that. Thanks to all who tuned in and who came to join us. And we look forward to seeing you next week as well.